Eat this, don't eat that. Could these dietary recommendations be any more confusing? Well, today we're going to be looking at ways to simplify your choices and conquer SIBO at the same time. Now, before I start giving you specifics on what to do with your dietary choices, I feel like I have to address maybe what would be called the elephant in the room, which are all these recommendations, these specific diets that are often promoted as being an adjunct or really part of the treatment process when it comes to SIBO. Well, today we're going to really look at those with a critical eye and try to pick apart whether or not you should be using those. Now, I want to also emphasize what the goal is when it comes to your dietary choices as you're going through this process. Your goal is one thing and one thing only, and that is to restore the balance of the microorganisms in your small intestine. That is the focus right now. And so, of course, SIBO is an imbalance and overgrowth of these organisms. So that sole focus, that sole goal right now is to restore balance to the microorganisms in the small intestine. Now, there are 3 diets that I'm going to take a look at with you, and we're going to talk about why these just blatantly don't make sense, why we don't need to be thinking about these, and if there is anything we can take away from them, what that actually is. But let me just go through these one by one with you. So the first one is going to be what's known as the elemental diet. Now, I do want to be fair to this diet that the elemental diet, specifically in SIBO, has been shown to be effective at controlling SIBO symptoms and helping to reduce the overgrowth. And it did this in a 14-day time frame. But there's a big catch when it comes to the elemental diet. And that catch is that you're not just going to go into the grocery store or to your local farmer's market or even from your food delivery service or your local ranch or farm that you purchase food from. You're not just going to get things from these sources that are going to allow you to stay on an elemental diet. An elemental diet requires very specific constituents. For example, when it comes to proteins, you're taking individualized amino acids. You can't take any form of protein. If those amino acids are combined to make peptides, you can't eat that stuff. It has to be individual amino acids, right? And so the diet can be very complex, very cumbersome to stay on unless you have resources to help do that. And here's the other thing I'll tell you on this. As someone who's treated patients with SIBO for a lot of years now, it is just not necessary to try to implement an elemental diet. That is in the 1% of the 1% of the 1% that needs something like that. It is a very small portion of the population that needs this form of dietary intervention. So from there, I think we go to what is arguably the most commonly recommended diet for individuals with SIBO, and this is what's known as the FODMAPs diet, FODMAPs. And I need to point out right from the outset that the FODMAPs diet was not designed for SIBO. The FODMAPs diet was designed for irritable bowel syndrome. And granted, there's some overlap between IBS and SIBO, but the two are distinctly different entities. Now, when we look at the evidence base for applying the FODMAPs diet in SIBO, quite frankly, the evidence to do this is purely hypothetical at this point. It's not based in any evidence practice, any evidence database whatsoever. And it also makes you really ask some questions about the foods, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, the foods that fall into the FODMAPs category, because many of those foods are also potentially, not even potentially, but many of those foods are health promoting to the microbiota. So we're cutting out foods that are in general looked at as beneficial substances for the microbiota. They generally are considered to have a prebiotic, a probiotic promoting, a prebiotic role. So there's some real question marks here when it comes to the FODMAPs diet. Now, when you look at these FODMAPs, let me go through these. So you have, these are considered to be fermentable, hence the F. And then you get these oligosaccharides. These are from 3 to 10 sugars long. Then you get disaccharides, which are going to be 2 sugars long. And then you get into the monosaccharides, which are just an individual sugar. And then you get into the polyphenols. Or not, I'm sorry, not polyphenols, polyols. These are the alcohol-containing sugars, the polyols, not polyphenols. We'll clarify and differentiate those in a moment. But as it relates to those individual FODMAPs, so for example, when you look at the oligosaccharides can directly have prebiotic effects. And they can, again, stimulate the growth of the microbiota. Let me give you examples on the disaccharides. The 2 most common ones here are going to be lactose and sucrose. Sucrose, you know, is table sugar, lactose, milk sugar. And the one thing that I would point out when it comes to lactose is that lactose, when it is not being metabolized, for most individuals, that's an indication of dysbiosis. So as you clean up the dysbiosis, the ability to metabolize lactose is going to be there because those microbiota are in large part what are doing that. The other thing is that when you talk about shaping the profile of the microbiota in the gut, there are many constituents to dairy that can support that. So for example, things that we call lactoferrin or lactoalbumin, glycomacropeptide, these are the kinds of things that actually are beneficial to the microbiota. So when we cut out quality dairy sources, which are going to be things like raw dairy, A2 dairy, those are what are considered a quality dairy source. And as I talk about dairy here and there throughout this video, that's really what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about just your off-the-shelf dairy, but these quality dairy sources that contain these active constituents in it that I just made mention to, those are actually going to be beneficial. And so consuming some lactose in there, when you're stimulating those other microbiota to help digest the lactose, you may be actually eliminating a food category that could be helping to restore your microbiome, that could be helping to restore and normalize the bacterial profile in your gut. And then you get into the monosaccharides. So the one that comes to mind here a lot of times is going to be fructose. And fructose, and let's think now about sources of fructose in the diet, predominantly fruit, not high fructose corn syrup, not refined sources, just fruit or fructose as we would find it in fruit, as you find it in the diet from real whole food sources. That is going to come along with several other components. So for example, I've got an apple here, and this apple has fructose in it. Ironically, it also has some polyols in here at a low level. But the point being on this is that consuming this apple, which is rich in polyphenols, so to differentiate that term, those are the antioxidants in the food. But this fructose source is rich in polyphenols, it's rich in fiber that is going to stimulate the microbiota and allow them to proliferate and to ultimately help overcome this dysbiosis state. And so I'm kind of starting to beat a dead horse here, but the point on this is that when we start talking about the FODMAPs diet, we end up cutting out a lot of things in the FODMAPs diet that could actually be yielding benefits. And it's one of the big reasons I don't recommend it, even for those that do promote this. And when I say those, I'm referring to the researchers that have studied this and the research studies, not just the general applications. Even in those scenarios, it is acknowledged that within 4 to 6 weeks, if you're not seeing benefits on a FODMAPs diet, you need to move away from it. And it's really not going to do you any good to come back to that diet. The other thing that I think is noteworthy on this is that conditions like diabetes, as an example, there's a connection between SIBO and diabetes. And we see that there's examples where individuals consuming a FODMAPs diet is actually beneficial to diabetes. So if we can better control the diabetic state, the glucose control, glycemic state, if you will, if we can better control the glucose, then that's going to have some spillover effect into having a reduction in small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, the SIBO. And so it doesn't make sense to completely cut out all these food categories, especially on an ongoing basis. And the other thing that's noteworthy on this is that what we're really, when someone implements the FODMAPs diet, what they're really trying to do is either they're trying to reduce the accumulation of fluid, what's known as the osmotic balance. They're trying to reduce the accumulation of fluid in the bowel so you don't get a flushing effect, or they're trying to prevent the ingestion of something that is directly going to act as a fermentable food source or allow the production of gas and bloating. But here's the thing, that becomes, again, back to this point that I talked about with the elemental diet, this can become restrictive. And so typically the FODMAPs diet gets implemented as this top-down approach where you have to get rid of everything and then we'll slowly start to add things back in and see how you respond to them. This is also one of the problems where when you look at this and how this particular diet has been studied, this is a problem with it because everything is eliminated to see how you react to the elimination, and nothing is actually put into the diet in these studies to incrementally see what food it is that's actually being the trigger. And so you just don't get the information that you're looking for here. A better strategy with this, and one that can be applied more universally, is a bottom-up approach. So what that means is that you're only taking out things that are potential triggers, right? Maybe some of the biggest things that could be a problem, or that you know when you ingest them, they're going to be a reaction for you. But you don't take out everything, and you don't make the diet so narrow and so restrictive that you start eliminating foodstuffs that are going to be beneficial to your microbiota. All right, so that's enough about the FODMAPs diet. I think you guys get the point on the FODMAPs, that FODMAPs is not where it's at, and that's not where we need to go, okay? Now, that brings us to the third diet that is oftentimes talked about with SIBO, and that's going to be the gluten-free diet. And the gluten-free diet truly is just a derivative of the FODMAPs diet. So when we're looking at the oligosaccharide category, wheat is going to be considered in the oligosaccharide category, and it comes out of the diet. Now, I will say with this that there is very, very minimal evidence to support a gluten-free diet with SIBO. However, I do think that because of the way that wheat is handled, because of some of the chemicals that are applied to wheat crops, these are going to be some of the problems that can manifest with you consuming these foods, and that can have a negative impact on your microbiota. And there are frankly better ways, more nutrient-rich ways to get the compounds, the fiber sources, the polyphenols, the things that are going to stimulate the health of your microbiome. Frankly, there are better ways to get those foods in. We're going to talk about those here in just a moment. Okay, so that is everything that you don't want to get sucked into. So don't get sucked into the elemental diet. Don't get sucked into FODMAPs. Don't get sucked into a gluten-free diet. And I know I took a lot of time going through these, but I need you to understand where the pitfalls are so that you don't make those mistakes. And as folks are out there talking about these things, because they are such still popular recommendations, in spite of everything that I've said, in spite of all the evidence that exists to the contrary, they are still adamantly recommended. So enough of that. Let's talk about what you need to be doing. And I want to set the stage on this by noting that in many ways, what you do with your diet in terms of how you eat is far more important than actually what you're eating with your diet. Now, What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is when we need to take a common sense approach to eating. And some of this is going to sound like things that your parents told you when you were young, because we probably all heard it. And that is, we need to, first of all, when we sit down to eat a meal, we need to mindfully sit down and eat that meal. So that means that we don't need to inhale that meal. We need to actually be slower and more methodical with that meal, completely chew that food up so that when that food reaches the small intestine, it is more easily digested, it's more easily assimilated, and we also get in a frame of mind that is going to help us with digestion. So we can't, this is the old fight or flight versus rest or digest. You need to be in a rest and digest state versus a fight or flight, right? If you're trying to eat on the run and you're maybe scrolling on your phone, getting worked up, looking at something on your phone, that is not ideal when it comes to optimizing how you're assimilating and digesting food, okay? So first of all, we need to be intentional about how we're going to eat. The second thing that is important to note with this is when we eat. And when we eat is really big here. And so we want to focus on three main meals: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and we want to avoid snacking. Now, why is that? Well, the reason that we want to avoid snacking is that the more frequently you eat, the more you're inhibiting what's known as the migratory motor complex. Now, let me explain this for just a minute. The migratory motor complex is going to be a neurological response that helps you flush bacteria from the small intestine to the large intestine and then ultimately out of the bowels. When you're constantly eating, you're shutting down that flushing mechanism. We need to harness that flushing mechanism. So the idea with this is that we want to stick to our three main meals: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then avoid the snacks. And this, I'm really suggesting this to you for the 30 days that you're doing the antimicrobials that you've already started. Now, you can do it longer than that, and you can continue to nurture that migratory motor complex, that sweeping action, if you will. You can still do all that after the 30 days, but during the 30 days is when it's going to be most critical. Now, in terms of what is actually the evidence out there for what you should be eating when you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, frankly, guys, there haven't been many studies done on this. There haven't been a lot of things that I can go not factually, I'm going to tell you some factual things, but I can't look at it in the evidence-based literature and say, this is exactly what it says, this is what the consensus is, and this is what you need to adhere to, okay? So instead, what we're going to have to do is look at what are some patterns that have been shown to just from anecdotal experience, from my observation and working with patients, that have been shown to be effective, but that also just logically make sense over time. And so these can be applied whether you're a person who this is your first round through dealing with SIBO, or you're somebody who you've gone the gamut before and you're treatment resistant, right? You've not responded well to previous interventions, right? It doesn't matter where you fall. These are the common sense approaches that we need to take. So number one is that you have to have an adequate amount of dietary protein. You have to, because that adequate protein is what's going to maintain the integrity of your gastrointestinal tract. It's what's going to ultimately act as a healing resource. It's going to provide you with the nutrients. Typically, quality proteins are going to be more nutrient-rich foods. So for example, if you add some good free-range quality eggs to your diet, right? You can eat those. Going to have some good fat in there as well. Just some other protein sources, right? So maybe you like a type of sausage. This is a beef sausage. You could do a venison sausage. You could do a ground beef as another option. This is one that we produce at Harvest Hills Ranch. You could do, for example, chicken thighs, free-range pastured chicken. You could do ground turkey, ground chicken, different steaks if you like steak. These are all options. And the important thing about this is that Many of the nutrient deficiencies that manifest with SIBO, we're going to talk about that later on, but many of the nutrient deficiencies that are a byproduct of SIBO, many of those are addressed by consuming this, by consuming your grass-fed and finished beef, B12, zinc, selenium, your vitamin A. These are the kind of nutrients that we're talking about. So make sure you get quality protein and make sure you get enough protein in your diet. Animal proteins are going to be best because they're complete proteins, they're more nutrient rich, but get enough. What does enough look like? If you just want a simple starting point that is on the higher side from common recommendations, 1 gram per pound of body weight is what I would recommend for you, right? If you just switch that up a little bit, if some of you are more kilogram oriented, that is 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So either 1 gram per pound of body weight or 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, whichever way you want to say that, comes out to the same number. So adequate protein is the number 1. I want to go back to my second recommendation is going to be dairy. Now again, many people blast dairy as dairy's a problem. Dairy is not a problem. There's so many beneficial attributes to dairy that are often overshadowed by the wrong kind of dairy, the processing of dairy, the pasteurization of dairy. A raw A2 source of dairy that maintains all of the bioactive peptides, bioactive nutrients in it that are healing for the gut, that can be consumed, and you will be able, for most individuals, to manage the lactose in that, because again, the microbiota are mostly what's metabolizing the lactose. It's not your lactase enzyme. That declines with age. So you're depending on other mechanisms to do that, and your microbiota are the mechanism there. So dairy can be a huge attribute. I find that individuals that consume dairy and that are using the quality sources like I'm talking about, the A2 sources, and maybe they're doing, it's raw A2, but maybe they're doing just drinking the milk, maybe they're doing a yogurt with it, a kefir. Any of these types of things are going to nourish that microbiota. And this is something else I need to mention. As you're stimulating that microbiota, this is one thing that the FODMAPs diet doesn't do, and that it doesn't nourish the microbiota, right? So I mentioned that, but it also knocks out species like bifidobacterium. If you've ever picked up a probiotic, you'll find bifidobacterium in most probiotics. Akkermansia, Faecalibacterium presnitzii. These are organisms that maybe you haven't heard of, but they are very, very crucial organisms in maintaining the balance of your microbiota. A FODMAPs diet decreases the numbers and presence of these organisms, and the incorporation of things like dairy and these adequate protein sources and some of these other foods I'm getting ready to mention here, this is what you need. All right, next on the list is going to be fruit. And with all of these that I'm mentioning here, these are going to, if you notice that you react to it, don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Hey, you know what? I ate 2 apples and these 2 apples gave me some excess gas. You know what? Let's just go down to 1 apple. Let's just try 1 apple in the morning and see how you do with 1 apple as opposed to just tossing the apple out. We don't want to do that, because you're negating a lot of the beneficial compounds in there that may be optimizing that microbiome. And if you don't consume these foods, you're potentially slowing the process down, right? So whether that's apples, oranges, bananas, blueberries, blackberries, cherries, kiwi, cantaloupe, watermelon, mango, you name it, guys. You can see it's a long list. Whatever your fruit preference is, just give consideration that if you react to it, then just cut the amount back. In fact, I find this interesting too, and I'm going to use this to jump back again. It's called a low FODMAP diet, not a no FODMAP diet, okay? So it doesn't mean even in that context that you have to completely eliminate these things. Better yet, just go down to a level that you can manage. The next is going to be your vegetables, and so that probably seems like a likely follow-up to fruits, and indeed it is. But here's what I'm going to tell you when it comes to vegetables. Not all vegetables are created equal, and you're better off consuming vegetables that are of a fruit-like nature rather than the plant. So let me differentiate that. The plant, a vegetable that would be the plant, would be spinach, kale, where you're actually eating the plant itself, okay? Now, a fruit-like vegetable is going to be a tomato, a pepper, a yellow squash, a zucchini, where it actually grows on the plant, but you disconnect it from the plant and you eat it. So it is the fruit of the plant and not the plant. We would eat the pepper, but we would not eat the pepper plant. So eat the pepper, okay? Now, there's another category in here, which is going to be your root vegetables. So things like your potatoes. Again, be mindful, prioritize your proteins in here, prioritize your healthy fats. I didn't mention that. Things like your butter, your grass-fed finished butter, beef tallow, venison tallow, bison tallow, any of these types of things, these saturated fats, some olive oil in there could be advantageous in this conversation as well. Those are the main supplemental fats that, if you're looking for fats that you're not getting in your food directly, those would be some additional fat sources there, okay? So we've got the protein, we've got the fat sources, we've got dairy, we talked about fruits, we talked about vegetables. Stick to the fruit of the plant as the vegetable, not the plant directly. And then the root vegetables, white potatoes, your white sweet potatoes, orange sweet potatoes, purple sweet potatoes, even your red and white potatoes, just as we typically call those. Those are all fine. Just be mindful if they cause symptoms, how much you consume, and you want to not prioritize those, prioritize the proteins. Now, what about coffee? Everybody likes to ask about coffee as part of the diet. Well, when it comes to coffee, you have to ask yourself, is my SIBO presentation of a diarrhea nature or is it of a constipation nature? If it is more of a diarrhea nature, it's going to be best for you to avoid coffee. If it's more of a constipation nature, you could consume it, or maybe you don't fall into either one of those categories, that's possible too, then you can still consume coffee. Coffee is going to have polyphenols in there that can support the microbiota, but you don't want to use coffee as a crutch to try to force motility in the bowels, right? We're going to talk about that going forward, but you can use the coffee if you're not having diarrhea and you just enjoy coffee. I would generally, for reasons we'll talk about also, stop consuming this around midday. Don't consume in the latter half of the day. You don't want this to interfere with your sleep, because that could have some potential impact on the overgrowth in the small intestine as well. So, just consider what type of presentation you have for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. How do you enjoy coffee? When do you enjoy coffee? And just moderate your coffee intake based on your presentation. Okay, so I'm going to admit to you, this turned out to be a lot longer than what I anticipated, and I needed you to understand what not to do with your diet. Because there's so many things that you consistently hear out there. If you do any amount of searching online, you're going to find individuals steering you down these roads of elemental diet, FODMAPs diet, gluten-free diet. Don't buy into it for the reasons that I told you. I gave you some great reasons to not buy into that. And then, as far as what you do, adequate amount of protein. Here's your summary. Adequate amount of protein, ideally somewhere between 1.6 and 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, or just 1 gram per pound. Okay, however you want to do that. A lot of diversity in there: eggs, chicken, turkey, beef, bison, venison, whatever your preference is that you like as far as your animal-based proteins. Your fats, you want to do the saturated fats, like your predominantly saturated fats, like grass-fed butter. You want to do your tallow sources, that could be beef, venison, bison, and then you can also do some olive oil mixed in there here and there. Don't heat it up too much. So you've got that's your fats. Then we want to look at dairy where it makes sense. A2 unpasteurized raw is what we're looking for there. And then we want to look at our fruits, consume those to the level that you can handle them. And listen, worst case scenario, if you've got to cut those out for a short period of time, for 2, 3, 4 weeks, hey, do it. But then you can start working those things back in, and once that dysbiosis is under control, you shouldn't have the problem with the fructose and the fruits. Then you're going to get into your vegetables. Vegetables that are of a fruit-like nature, peppers, your tomatoes, things of that nature. And you're going to avoid the vegetables that are the plant itself, okay? And then when it comes to coffee, you got to figure out if coffee works for you. You don't want to be stimulatory to your bowels, but if you're not having a diarrhea form of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, if that's not one of your symptoms, enjoy your coffee. You can have some additional benefits from it. So there's your outline. That's what your diet's going to look like. There's not so much about do's and don'ts, just some general guidelines. And remember, common sense eating. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, avoid the snacks, be mindful and purposeful when you sit down to eat a meal. That's just general good advice at any point in life, right? So there you go, a simple guideline of where to go with your SIBO diet. All right, talk soon.